My name is Chaumtoli Huq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins. Law at the Margins is a social media platform that aims to raise up perspectives that are often not heard on law and social justice. Through lawatthemargins.com, you can read great articles by lawyers, activists, and organizers that are working on a number of issues such as labor, immigration, on-the-ground activism. Today, we're joined by Phoebe Taubman, a senior staff attorney at A Better Balance, and Anamaria Segura, who is an attorney at MFY Legal Services, as well as the vice president of her legal services union. We were also going to be joined by Anino Catherine, who is the general secretary for Uganda Textile and Garment Workers. But unfortunately, I learned from her that there was a factory fire that resulted in the death of 6 workers. And understandably, as the trade union leader, she has been having to deal with that crisis. And our thoughts and prayers go out to the families who are impacted by this fire. And we will organize a separate chat with Anino, but you can also read her great article at lawatthemargins.com, where she talks about being a female organizer and how she raised up through the ranks and became a leader in the garment industry. So stay tuned for that so we can reschedule. But we have with us our great 2 panelists, and we're going to focus on the occasion of the International Women's Day. Before I go to that, I do want to give a little acknowledgement to Albert Garcia, who is our social media consultant. Because he's helping me, his partner, Grisel, is watching their daughter. So in the spirit of women's rights and unpaid labor, I want to actually acknowledge folks who put this Google chat together. So with that, let's begin. I want to encourage folks to think about questions that they may have. There's a Q&A feature on the left-hand side of the Google chat, and you can ask those questions to me, and I'll pose that to our guests. And also, I want to thank Joda B., also from the MFY Legal Services, for live tweeting this event for a bit, and then she has to run off to a meeting. And again, thankful for both of our guests for taking their time out of the day. So let's start with Phoebe. I know that you, just starting with the personal, you are a mother, and you also work at the Better Balance, which looks at sort of work and the barriers for women in terms of the workplace. What are issues that you've encountered as a woman, as a mother, and as a worker in terms of being able to fully participate in the workplace?
Well, thank you, first of all, Chaumtoli, for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I would say, as a personal matter, I've been very lucky to have carved out this place for myself in a field where, you know, and the people I work with on a daily basis are aware of the importance of child and caregiving in addition to the work that we do. And so I've definitely had other career where I've been in less friendly and less open-minded workplaces where there's an assumption that, you know, women aren't going to be as dedicated to their work once they become mothers. And I've seen that firsthand. I've seen it for colleagues of mine who've been pushed out of their work essentially because they felt like they had no other choice. But I do count myself among the lucky because right now, as you mentioned, I have 2 small children. I work part-time, and the work I do is really meaningful and amazing, even though I'm only doing it officially 3 days a week. So I feel very fortunate in that place I found for myself. I've been able to overcome some of these obstacles.
Why do you think you've been able to manage this part-time schedule? What are some institutional things that A Better Balance as an organization has done to allow you to accommodate both your role as mother and as an attorney? Because I think maybe that might be something that could shed light onto other organizations and institutions.
Well, the organization, as you mentioned, to address the conflicting demands of work and family, and we do that through public policy service. So our mission is one that the founders are very committed to, not only in the work, but also as bosses and as employers. So a lot of us have the flexibility to work from do 2 out of my 3 days for the most part, and that was especially important for me is when my children are sick, around time when I was nursing my children, to be able to nurse them in person, have to be pumping at the office, which is also an option, obviously, but in many ways a less fun sometimes. The organization is very understanding that really what's most important is that you get your work done. It doesn't really matter when and where it happens for the most part. That they invest a lot of responsibility in all of us who work there, and they trust us to do what we need to do when it's going to work to get done. And I think that culture is something that even a lot of workplaces that have good policies or HR branches have written up to say, we offer, a friendly workplace. It comes down to the practice and whether you can walk the talk. And I think A Better Balance as an organization is really on the cutting edge of doing that.
So, Anamaria, I want to bring you into this conversation. Start with us personally in terms of your own background that you care to share, where you've seen sort of challenges of being a woman, a worker. It need not be in the instance of being a mother, but maybe relationships that you have in terms of your family or caregiving. And then share with us, I know that recently you at MFY Legal Services went on strike, and in part because of leave policy issues. Why was that important to you as a staff attorney worker? Why is that issue important just generally to strike on?
Sure, yes. Thank you, Chaumtoli, and thanks for having me on. And thanks to Joda, my awesome colleague and a member of the bargaining team in the latest round of negotiations. I can't say enough about her work. But yeah, I mean, personally speaking, I can say I've been fairly lucky. I have a lot of strong women in my family who have been, my parents are both Colombian. I have a lot of aunts in Colombia who, one's a lawyer, one's a doctor. They've been very, even my grandmother, were all very kind of fierce about, taking jobs that were male-dominated and not really apologizing for, for their gender as they kind of made inroads in some of these professions in a really patriarchal society. And our family also had a very strong set of patriarchs, and they've been an example for me. Throughout my life, and my mother stayed at home raising me and my 3 siblings, but she's always been super supportive of my work. So I feel like, for me and for my sister, we've had really great examples and support in our family that have allowed us to kind of, really pursue our professions. And I'd love to talk about my role in the union and kind of the work we've been able to do. I'm, like you said, the vice president of the MFY vice president for our local LSSA 2320. We just came back from a 3.5-week strike, a little bit shorter than 3.5 weeks, in what I will say was the coldest February since the Depression. It was just, picketing in like sub-zero weather is something that I'm gonna always remember. Somehow now fondly, now that it's 50 degrees outside, but the issues that we were dealing with were issues that in many ways were affecting women of color, and my colleagues, and also affecting what we were fighting for was for our clients. So some of the things that we won was getting closer to equity for our support staff in terms of salary scale increases. The previous CBA, collective bargaining agreement, basically would continue to award attorneys higher percentage increases as they increase their years of service at MFY, whereas non-attorneys, who are primarily, all our support staff are women of color, would receive, as they progressed, and I'm talking decades of service, would get a lower percentage raise. And so you had this incredibly elitist system that was affecting women of color primarily on staff. And so the union really stuck together and decided to go on strike in part to try to challenge this really unfair system. And in terms of some other basic things, I mean, I love what Phoebe said about walking or walking the talk, I think is what you said, because I work in the Workplace Justice Project. A lot of what we do is to try to fight for the rights of women in the workplace, women who are being really taken advantage of. My clients are primarily Latino women who are being either not paid wages fairly or are being discriminated against. Some of them are facing egregious sexual harassment. So seeking justice for our clients, you know, through the Workplace Justice Project, there was a real disconnect in terms of how our employer was looking at workplace justice. We had no paid parental leave policy up until now. We've won a paid parental leave policy. So you know, that was one of our kind of refrains, was if you're a social justice organization with a workplace justice project, you know, walk the talk, to use Phoebe's term. I could talk forever about the union experience, but one other thing that we were on strike for was also for our clients, and being able to preserve MFY as a place where we were encouraging experienced talent to stay, so that we could be better attorneys for our clients, who are, you know, primarily, you know, the New Yorkers who are in the most vulnerable positions, and for me, primarily low-wage women workers.
Great. I'm really glad that you talked about using your position as lawyers to advocate for support staff that may not have the same bargaining position to uplift themselves. So I want to shift now to Phoebe. So all this sounds good, and listeners might think, well, you guys have a cushy life. You're two attorneys, you know, but what about the bulk of low-wage workers? I'm in Bangladesh right now, and I'm looking at conditions of garment workers, and this is what Anino Catherine also sort of looks at in Uganda. And the pay scale and the poverty is so enormous, and the barriers to look at the work, the day of a worker that was described to me, a woman. She gets up in Bangladesh. A worker said she gets up early in the morning, prepares breakfast for her children, goes to work at 8, works a full day till 7 or 8 if it's overtime, maybe later if the brands or the garments need to be shipped. Come home, make dinner, maybe takes care of her husband, maybe rushes home during lunchtime, and also again prepares lunch for her husband, and the family don't really take much responsibilities at the household. Oftentimes malnourished because she's not getting the nutrition because she's feeding everyone else and she's not eating herself, and then sleeping late to get up again. So when we think about women and work, and we think about low-wage workers in the United States, how do we address the barriers? And what are you seeing, Phoebe? What are the ways in which our legal system, or how can we address some of these sort of poverty-related barriers? So
what usually resonates with me, Chaumtoli, because I think the core mission of our organization is about through public policy and direct service to value the work of caregiving, because that work is often shouldered by women in cultures around the globe and undervalued as a result. And so the story you tell, a woman who's running home to make lunch for her family, even though she's also staying and sort of working late at overtime, and herself is malnourished as a result, I think a lot of the caregiving women are expected to do culturally has just simply not been valued. It's been taken for granted, and it has real health and economic impacts, not only on women, but on the broader society. So in the U.S., we see that we have a culture that doesn't really take account of caregiving work and often does it. And so we see that in the form of discrimination against mothers. Often it starts pregnancy. We have a lot of people we've heard from who are forced out of a job because they simply some modest change to their workplace, a small accommodation to be able to stay healthy and keep work and earning a paycheck. But it also happens, to men who want to take on caregiving, and that's why, it's often about women, but it can be also about men who are bucking for the stereotype of what male, priority should be about being the breadwinner and not really taking on any of the caregiving work. And when men buck that trend, they also back and see discrimination in the workplace. It's also about caregiving for elders, and you know, the U.S. is one of the only places in the world that doesn't have paid families. Anamaria referenced in her union fight, but we also don't have a national paid sick time. So even just, you know, when a child is sick, people are often, we've heard from many folks around the who lose a job because they have to stay home with a sick child. And so as an organization, working on solutions to change a lot of these barriers in the workplace for those who shoulder caregiving responsibilities, because that caregiving is still has to be done. Our society really depends on it for our flourish, but we also need to value it and support it. So we're fighting for paid sick time laws across the country, making a ton of progress. Just in the last year, we've seen so many of these new laws passed in cities and states. We're fighting for paid family leave at the state level, and also ultimately for the whole country. And I think these kinds of legal reforms, they also, you know, change the culture, but they also provide real benefits for individuals, especially those who are working where they don't have the bargaining power or the influence to be able to negotiate for these things on their own, the support of the law behind them to really get what they deserve.
You mentioned about a comparison around the world. Can you give us an idea of what are some leave policies in other countries? What are you seeing, some models?
Well, yeah, there's a study that sort of gets changed in the exact countries every year, but basically most of the world, and it's not just the highly economies, it's pretty much all countries in the world, guarantee some paid family leave. It covers maternity leave for a mother after giving birth. It covers family leave to care for seriously sick and ill relatives. So one at 178 countries around the world that provided paid family leave, and the U.S. was alone. Sometimes it's with Swaziland and Papua New Guinea. There's been changes in which countries don't have it, but you can count on one hand the countries that don't guarantee paid family leave. And similarly, similar study found 163 countries globally that guarantee paid sick time. Again, the U.S. is sort of a major outlier. And, there's difference within these places, obviously, in how much time you're talking about, how much wage replacement is guaranteed during that time off. But in the U.S., we're so far behind the curve. We have an unpaid family leave law that's 20+ years old, but people are either not eligible or they simply can't afford to take unpaid leave. I mean, how do you continue to pay bills when you don't have income coming in, especially if you're welcoming a new baby or dealing with a medical crisis? So, it's clear from a lot of the international comparisons that even places that don't have the wealth and the resources of the U.S. and our economy are able to provide some of these basic supports for their citizens, and we're trying to change that reality here in the U.S.
Great, thanks. I want to encourage folks, if you have questions, to use the Q&A feature that you should be able to see an icon on the left-hand side of the screen. Anamaria, I want to ask you, you mentioned your work with Latino workers. Can you share what are the unique challenges that they face as women, as workers, as mothers and caregivers? And then also, if you mentioned your background in terms of being of Colombian origin, are there examples globally that you know of or heard of that you can share where folks are doing this work, women in work balance correctly? Shed some light on that as well.
Sure. And yeah, I didn't. So most of my clients are undocumented, and so most of them are Latino, but I would say that a lot of the challenges that I see them facing come from their immigration status. you know, in some very practical ways, including like literally what the remedies are for their rights having been violated, and you know, and in more kind of predictable ways, which is just the incentive to speak up against your employer, no matter how abusive, is lessened when there's a fear of retaliation, and what that would mean for you know, the worker and her family. So one of my frustrations has been, in an example I can talk about right now, and I actually was thinking that I'd contact A Better Balance about the paid sick law. I have this client who has 2 daughters. She's a single mom. She has 2 daughters. She's a fairly recent immigrant from Honduras. She is undocumented, and she had to take a few days off from her home health aide job to first tend to one kind of emergency situation for her teenager, and then terrible luck, she had to another emergency situation for, I think, her like 6-year-old, and her boss ended up firing her for taking the time, first suspending her, not giving her hours, and then ultimately firing her. And so we were, you know, I told her, of course, I'd be happy to represent you and to maybe send a demand and to try to get your job back, which is all she really wanted. Was to get her job back so she could support her family. And then when I looked at what would be available in terms of a remedy for her if they just refused to give her job back, even in litigation, or you know, in terms of litigation, I realized because she's undocumented, even if she was fired illegally, completely discriminatorily, you can't get her job back, because if you're undocumented, you can't get reinstated and you can't get back pay, because of that 2004 decision by the Supreme Court, that you know, and I'm sure you all are familiar with it, but knowing that it was a terrible decision and then seeing how it, in very real ways, it limits our abilities as social justice lawyers to make a difference for our clients is incredibly frustrating. And so that her experience, and she happens to be Latina and she happens to be an immigrant, and she's undocumented, but I feel like those limitations just exist, and I see them play themselves out in a lot of our cases, and thinking about what we can do with the law to make a difference. It's really turned me into an advocate of trying to figure out ways to use organizing as another piece. And in my office, we don't have an organizer associated with our project, but a huge part of what I think makes a difference is being able to hook up our clients with a group that's organizing, you know, because of all the protections and the power that comes with, you know. And I always say I'm a lawyer, and I can only work on the laws that exist, and some of them are very flawed. So seek out collective ways to kind of advocate for yourself. The other, you know, as to your other question, I have to say I'm embarrassingly unfamiliar with even some of the statutes on the books in Colombia. I will say that I remember in speaking to family members about unemployment insurance that Colombia surprisingly had a much more generous kind of system for awarding unemployment benefits to its workers than we have here in New York. And New York is pretty stingy generally in terms of what you get weekly, but the presumption in Colombia is that you will receive, or at least in the city where I don't know if it's regional, but the presumption is that you will receive some level of workers of unemployment for a much longer period of time. And I wish I could say exactly how much, but I was kind of blown away because, you know, as Phoebe said, you know, the U.S. is, you know, has all these resources. We're a very wealthy country. How is it that we're so behind in some kind of very basic workers' rights issues?
No, I think that, you know, in Bangladesh, workers get 4 months paid maternity leave. The issue isn't the law. The issue here is in terms of enforcement. Because of lax enforcement, workers aren't able to oftentimes get what is legally owed. And I think that sort of is consistent with what Phoebe mentioned, that countries around, other countries outside the United States have fairly decent laws protecting women in the workplace. Enforcement is an issue. I do want to pick up this point that, Anamaria, that you raised in your example, is a limitation of legal remedies for those who are undocumented, low-income workers. And so organizing is I think, a key part of that, and I think that's a piece that's happening in Bangladesh, and it's talking to Anino in Uganda is happening there as well with a lot of challenges. But what else could we do to really increase or expand protections for low-wage women, because they seem to feel the brunt of the, being women, mothers, workers. They seem to be sort of feel the most burden of all of these identities. I mean, Phoebe, what could we do to specifically address poverty, motherhood? Is there legal strategies A Better Balance is looking at? Is there a community education strategy here? What are some ways in which we're trying to untangle that?
I think we're trying to use a variety of strategies, and as a legal organ, we do focus on law reform because we feel that, passing statutes that guarantee certain rights and benefits can be very powerful. Obviously, enforcement is a major issue, but it also starts to change cultural expectations and employer consciousness about how they should be treating their workforce. So, for example, in New York State, years back, domestic workers organized together to get a domestic worker bill of rights in New York, and that just to raise awareness about this whole workforce that was generally, not organized officially, often isolated in their workplaces, unable to really negotiate favorable terms, often being grossly mistreated by their employers, and to, raise awareness for our employers of domestic workers and may never have even thought of themselves as employers. They're somebody else's employee, and their household help is just sort of like what they need to keep their own careers moving, and they're not thinking about themselves as an employer or as a responsible employer. So I think that was an example of a way that legal reform can start to change the culture, especially for low-wage women. Another example that's sort of starting to grow that we're doing a lot of work in is around scheduling, because companies in retail and service these days will require workers to sort of be on call indefinitely for a shift, but not be paid for the time that they're sitting around waiting to find out if they have a work, or changing schedules at such short notice that it's just impossible to arrange any care to cover when your shift may be, because it's different every week and changing within days. So those kinds of scheduling practices, which companies have employed in order to sort of minimize their profits, completely disregard or don't even consider the impact on, especially to our relying on these hours to pay the bills, but also consistency in order to manage the rest of the responsibilities in their lives. So I think law reform is essential, and we're also doing a lot of public education so that laws that do exist are better known, because as we pass laws, they're not going to do much good if nobody knows about them. We do a lot of public education and trying to educate different populations about their rights and really empower people to help become their own best advocates, and to get people to talk to each other, to share information, and as you said, to organize, because I think that it is often a good strategy.
Great. I want to acknowledge a comment by Kim Lett on Twitter in terms of people don't realize how far behind we are in the U.S. when it comes to women's rights. So I want to thank Kim for that comment, and folks can actually tweet comments and questions. Just add the hashtag @Margins. We're going to slowly wind down our conversation. This is really the time to ask your question if you want to pose a question to the panelists. I want to ask Anamaria, we talked about immigration and women and work. We talked about poverty, women and work. I'm wondering, in MFY Legal Services, actually, disclosure, former MFY alum, attorney there. How about race, women and work? Are you seeing particular issues that Black women are facing in terms of mothering, caregiving, work challenges? that maybe we should really sort of talk about?
It's interesting, you know. I think it's hard to, just because of how small we are, we just can't speak to larger trends as often as maybe a membership organization can. I can say that individual clients I have certainly had, you know, ridiculous race discrimination fact patterns that I'd never, that before I started doing this work didn't think existed, or were as common as they seem to be. Not so much in the issues about trying to balance, you know, being a working mother, although that certainly exists, you know, for any low-wage woman worker. But in the retail, I do want to speak to the retail industry, because Phoebe mentioned the unpredictable scheduling, and I have to say, I've seen the Retail Action Project here in New York doing really incredible work in terms of fighting against these abusive, unfair scheduling practices, and calling out some large retailers for those practices, for the fact that they just become very impossibly not family friendly, and certainly not woman worker friendly. And the more I see about the retail industry, the more I see that they treat their women of color, the workers that are women of color, quite poorly, whether it's because of the scheduling issue or in terms of, you know, it's retail, so you have to look a certain way to be able to work a certain position. If you're a black woman, from what I've seen, you're much more likely to receive a job in the merchandise kind of stocking in the back than you are in the front of the store, wearing the clothes that the retailer is trying to sell. I have a client who, you know, was told that she couldn't wear her hair. She's African American. She's not allowed to wear her hair natural, you know, but she can wear her hair in braids or with extensions. And so, just kind of certainly race-related, you know, discrimination. We're still trying to figure out, kind of in that case, what the best remedies are. She did eventually complain, and she was fired, so now we have a little bit more ammo in terms of her case. But those are, I mean, I can speak to those examples and those kinds of problems, with big problems with race that I've seen in the retail industry.
You know, I think in the fast food movement as well, where you see low-wage workers and you see the schedule shifts, it makes it unable for women to then get childcare, and then because they are already earning low wages, they are not able to afford affordable childcare. So there is this sort of effect. So this might be a future topic that theMargins needs to focus on. I do want to start to shift towards. We've talked a lot about childcare, paid leave, scheduling at the workplace, all of these barriers for women. Are there and in Bangladesh we see maternity leave enforcement and daycare on site being a big demand amongst garment workers because they have the challenges of childcare. And I have a sad story of, you know, children being left basically unattended as young as 4 because they cannot afford any childcare. In one instance, a worker's 4-year-old child drowned in this water tank because there was really lack of childcare. So I think that for women workers here in Bangladesh, they want childcare on site, daycare on site, because then at least they can, you know, protect just the life of their children. So is there an issue globally, based on your experiences, that women across the United States can converge on, that you think, Phoebe, that maybe we can collectively campaign for? Is there a common issue that we can find amongst all workers?
I couldn't quite tell if you were asking me to jump in and say, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think going back to where we said the conversation when we talked about sort of, you know, what were the major problems facing women in the workplace. And I said, you know, I think a lot of it is about the undervaluing of care work. That, you know, children need care, and in order for our societies to thrive, if they need care, they're going to grow up to be workers and citizens and contributors, and disregarding their need by, not providing childcare, etc., is really harmful to all of us. It's interesting you mentioned childcare on site, because we had someone who called our hotline who actually went back to her home country after an episode of pregnancy discrimination here in the U.S. Is now trying to find a job back at home. A terrible series of events. But she's noting that back at home, they have a law that says employers of a certain size have to provide child care on site. Everyone has recognized that that's the most cost-effective way for employers to have workers who feel confident in where their children are and their safety, and for employees to be able to come to work with their children, like save time in commuting, be able to check in on their kids if they get injured, or other things. It's just something hasn't even really sort of reached our screen in the U.S. in terms of public policy, although there are some employers who do that for their, to see, in other parts of the world it is the law, and people have seen the benefits. So I think, to your question about what's consistent across the globe, is that women are a key engine of economic production. I think without labor in the workplace around the world, all of us would be in a lot different place economically, and our countries would suffer. And so in order to be able to maintain their participation, of course, our governments and our societies and our policies have to acknowledge that there's also care work that they're doing, and that we need to support that as well.
Great. Anna, do you want to add in terms of, are there issues based that you think that might resonate globally?
I would just add that I think organizing and support for organized labor across causes and just across countries and globally is so essential. These themes are so consistent across societies, and I think that the more we can put in place mechanisms to support organized labor, and particularly in women heavy industries, I think that will go a long way.
Yes, actually, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's a part of Anino's piece. That's at the law at the margins, is how she's been able to use the trade union structure to obtain rights for women. So leveraging, organizing, and using unions as a way to get benefits that it's not available through the law. And in fact, that is something that I'm finding interviewing workers here in Bangladesh, that women workers are most active in organizing and on taking leadership, even though they are the most vulnerable and have the most burden in terms of carrying and work, because they see that the union as a way to get maternity leave benefits and to get child care on site. So they're actually seeing this organizing as a way to deal with the lack of law enforcement. So it echoes here in Bangladesh, Anamaria, what you're saying. So we do want to slowly, wrap up. I want to encourage folks who have questions to ask them now. You also will have an opportunity. There's an event page for this Google chat. On the event page, I've included a great report by A Better Balance on the motherhood penalty, which I guess you're in good company, because the ILO also, I guess, issued a similar type of report around how mothers are, additionally penalized in the workplace, and so there's going to be a lot of focus on caregiving, childcare, and so I think that we will see that as being kind of a global issue. And there are also some articles in terms of MFY strike, which I think folks should look at, and I want to congratulate the bargaining team on that. So, okay, all these problems, some good stuff, some positive solutions. How can people get involved who are listening? I mean, part of Law at the Margins' goal is to elevate the issues, have a discussion, but then to engage people, to involve them back into making some of these changes. So those who are listening, Phoebe, what would you say to them, to how some ways that they can get involved to address some of these issues that we've talked about?
Well, I think there's a lot of different ways to be involved depending on how you have and where you live and where you work. I mean, we've definitely encountered the challenge that parents see people, and it's hard often, you know, when they're juggling all these other challenges we've been discussing to get, you know, dedicate time to activism. But there are small things you can do. Like right now, we've got a petition going for paid family leave at the state level. Our governor was just quoted as saying that New York doesn't have the appetite for paid family leave, and we're trying to get enough people on board to sign and show him that, in fact, we do. We're hungry for it, and you know, that's what politicians respond to when they get the power of the people coming and telling them they need to act. So that's something small. We also encourage people to, you know, write letters to the editor, to call and contact their elected officials to ask they're not addressing these issues and why it's not a priority for them. And, you know, to speak to each other. There's a lot of consciousness raising that I think has to happen because folks think of these set of problems around managing family as sort of individual problems that they have to tackle on their own rather than as systemic that we all sort of face together and that require more systemic collective solutions. So I think that kind of awareness building is important to the extent that people listening feel motivated to, you know, follow up on any of these issues. We have on our website and on our sister organizations to get involved, and just as I said, to your networks and start bubbling up outrage. I think, you know, we often are so busy in our lives we don't really take the time to really express how some of these you know, sort of absences and holes in our laws are so appalling, and we need to generate that outrage.
Great, thank you. And I'll share that petition onto our event page. Anamaria, what are ways in which folks can get involved around women and work issues? Maybe, I mean, locally, or if there are other efforts you know, because I know that you work with a number of community-based organizations.
Sure. I mean, I could certainly rattle off some of our partners here and the folks that I know that are doing great work. I worry that I would forget a few of them, but I'm just going to name some of the folks that are doing great work that we work with. You know, Brand Workers International. I mentioned before the Retail Action Project, the Domestic Workers United. You know, the Make the Road. I mean, these are a lot of these folks have so much more connections with workers on the ground than I do here at MFY with our intake line, and so I'm always looking to hear from community groups what they're seeing and to find a way to get some of those workers to come to us. When we were on strike, some of the most effective ways of getting support was just when we were flyering, and we'd say, here's our website, here's who to call, here's our Twitter, and I think, you know, some people just walking on Broadway really wanted to know what on earth was going on and how could they support. And so even if you're just one person, if you hear about a campaign or an action that's happening, stopping by, asking how you can get involved is a really good way to not only motivate the folks on the picket who might be cold and tired and could use some encouragement, but also to find out more and to learn about how to get involved. Right now there's a car wash campaign in Park Slope, and there's the fast food worker, the Fight for 15 action that's coming up. I don't remember the exact date, otherwise I would pitch it, but going to pickets and showing up on your lunch hour if you can. April 15th, I think, is the date for that particular action. It might seem small if you're just one person, but it makes a big difference.
No, I think that's great. I think April 15th is the national day, and I think what the takeaway, you don't have to mention all the groups. We can post them on the event page, but to get involved in community-based organizations, whoever is in your neighborhood, to the outrage, you know, that Phoebe talks about, to get involved and to make the changes. You know, just as a personal anecdote, the last time MFY was on strike, actually in 2004, I was pregnant, so it was also winter, and I was a staff attorney, and so I was a mother out there. So I definitely agree with when you see folks who are fighting for their rights that to really come out and support. So this month is Women's History Month, International Women's Day, which was actually International Working Women's Day. Any final thoughts, Phoebe, on women and work? I want to focus on, oftentimes when we talk about work, we lose the gender focus. So I want to keep focus on, there's lots of great activity happening amongst the community-based organizations around raise the wage, but I want to keep focus on gender and work, women and work. What are some final thoughts that you'd like to share, reflections on that issue?
I think your point is a good one, that oftentimes we're talking about work without the gender angle. In particular, I can share that when we were fighting for paid sick time in New York City, a coalition of labor groups and public health advocates who saw the importance of paid sick time to prevent illness. But it was also important to talk about, the care of children and members, and this as a women's issue. And ultimately, as a matter of politics, the angle of gender on paid sick time in New York was a very effective way to get some movement from our elected officials, that really resonated. And so I think, these issues often sort of overlap with different areas of activism and different groups, but the gender angle is a powerful one to use in order to move a lot of these policies forward.
Great. Anamaria, any last thoughts around women, work, Women's History Month, International Women's Day? I mean, your own experience as a woman worker on strike. I mean, there's so much there, but some last reflections.
Yeah, I can say that in the history of just being in a leadership position in my union, there are definitely opportunities that we should take advantage of reflecting on the fact that even though we're doing progressive work in a progressive organization, that we should take stock of, look around and look who holds most of the leadership positions in a union, who holds most of the leadership positions in a progressive nonprofit, because oftentimes it's not women, and I think that encouraging women to take leadership positions, to set policy and missions of the organizations where they're doing good work, and maybe they're taking on leadership, but they might be forgetting, and I know I have, forgetting to look around and to make sure that we're pushing the envelope in terms of laying claim to leadership positions that have traditionally been filled by men. And I can say, I think without controversy, that my union umbrella, the UAW, I think is primarily headed by men, certainly historically. And I think that I've had some experiences in my own local where I've thought, oh wow, these challenges still exist in this progressive organization, and I have to remember that. And keep talking about it in our own local. Right now there's a union meeting that I'm going to miss, but we're going to encourage people to take on roles as delegates, and I'm hoping that some of our members who are women will take on those roles.
Great. I'm really glad you talked about leadership and women's leadership, and that's a whole other topic, and maybe both you and Phoebe could come back a different time and we can talk about that specifically. We do have to sort of close. I've already taken a lot of your time, and so I want to just give some thanks to Kim and Michelle Flores, who have been tweeting a lot of what was discussed. To thank Albert Garcia for hosting this Google chat. And then, of course, I am very grateful and thankful for Phoebe and Anamaria. These chats are a way in which we can come together on a common platform and hear what's happening sort of on the ground, reflect on it so that we can get involved and move forward. I really appreciate your time and your effort. And then finally, again, our well wishes to Anino and her members and their families who were impacted by the fire. At the beginning of the segment, I mentioned that Anino Catherine, who's the General Secretary of the Ugandan Garment Workers, was not able to attend or participate because 6 workers were killed in a fire. But you can read her excellent article about being a trade union leader and a woman on law@themargins.com. So thank you all for listening, and thank you both Anamaria and Phoebe for participating. Take care.
Thank you.